listening to Trending with Timmery, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics. National speaker Timmery Millington has been a passionate advocate for life as long as she can remember, helping Gen X through Z answer the call to true feminism and authentic manhood. Timmery holds a master's degree in biblical theology, and she covers this week's hottest stories from a Catholic worldview. You're listening to Trending with Timmery.
It is great to be with all of you. I am here with Father Tim Grumbach, one of our favorite guests here on Trending. He is the associate priest at St. Augustine Parish in Los Angeles, along with working with young Catholic professionals, Life Teen, and various other ministries in his spare time that he isn't giving to Trending.
Yeah, you would think that I've got nothing else to do, right? No. I love being here. I'm so grateful that you have me here.
We have to pray for energy for Father Tim because his one day off a week, he ends up at least once a month giving to us here at Trending. So
it's all grace. Actually, I have a friend that reminded me yesterday that the priesthood, you can't do it without grace, and that there's so much grace given to us just to do the daily life. And so that's what this all amounts up to. And
that's a really good testament and reminder for us, because we're talking about issues surrounding abortion, population collapse, the major trial of David Daleiden, one of the biggest pro-life hearings we have seen in quite a while, which they're in the preliminary trials for before a month-long trial beginning in October. So we'll be talking about that, an autopsy that has actually confirmed that a woman was killed by abortion, but we'll get into the nitty-gritty and politics of all that, so don't go away. Father Tim, I want to start by talking about the perspective that some people have on crisis pregnancy centers. You may know I did a recent video with Jubilee Media online, and I was one of three pro-life people with three pro-abortion individuals speaking about our perspective on abortion, trying to find some middle ground. And it was so interesting to me because when I'd bring up over and over again the work of the crisis pregnancy centers, one of the things I saw coming from the individuals was that they couldn't really quite believe that was possible, that people were willing to just help, that it was just random people from churches, not government entities, willing to help give people a car for a woman who's in crisis pregnancy or a formula, whatever it might be.
Yeah, and they're so struck by that charity in the real meaning of the word, of this desire to love and to show love to not just the unborn child, but to the mother, and to love them both. They're so struck by it, but their only attack they have left is, these people aren't trained to make medical decisions, as if love wasn't enough to actually take care of those who are most in need.
Oh, and it's so interesting that they have that perspective, yet we live in a time where, I think there's such a dependence at times for social services, yet when there's a social service offered to women for pregnancy, there's an attempt in the media to really smear it in many ways. And that's what we saw. I don't watch the show. I do not recommend it. We talked about it some time ago, 13 Reasons Why. But I heard that Chloe, one of the characters in 13 Reasons Why, ends up obtaining an abortion. And in preparing actually for this, she visited a crisis pregnancy center. And not only on the show, 13 Reasons Why, but also in interviews, the actress is Ann Winter. And she has been really smearing crisis pregnancy centers ever since she played that part in the show.
And they begin calling it fake abortion clinic, as if we're trying to be an abortion clinic, but we're just faking it. What a terrible use of language, that Orwellian turn of phrase, that they're just using language against us and misunderstanding the whole mission of the crisis pregnancy centers is, yes, to love them both and to invite love into the situation instead of this cold medical and using words like choice and consequentialism in such a way as to really make the culture of death come alive.
Yeah, and I get where Ann Winter is coming from, because in a sense I do. I have spent numerous years working in the crisis pregnancy centers. My parents opened up a maternity home when I was just a little girl, so for actually women to come and live in. So I've seen the great elements of crisis pregnancy center work and maternity homes, but I've also seen some of the aspects where maybe the people were a little pushy in how they conversed about certain moral issues, and that's unfortunate. I'm sorry when that happens, but I can say the vast majority of crisis pregnancy centers are incredibly loving, non-judgmental non-judgmental human beings who are doing everything they can to see you right where you're at, whether you are a 13-year-old girl who's pregnant, whether you're someone who has been raped, whether you're someone who's in a physically abusive relationship, wherever you may be. And what's incredible is that many of these crisis pregnancy centers walk with the women for years to come because they recognize that abortion attempt was just a band-aid for the rest of her circumstances that she really needs help with.
Yeah, that's a beautiful perspective, is understanding that so much of the culture is trying to handle the symptoms without understanding the root. And when we only try to fix the symptoms, and that can be, on the pro-life movement, sometimes only attempting to, cover up the symptoms without understanding the root. I don't know if the pro-abortion side has the ability to really get down to the root of it and understand, and with especially the language that we have of sin and redemption and the dignity of the human person, but all they can use is this, almost, lacking a philosophical way of understanding choice and consequence, and where choice becomes the God. And instead of, God giving us a choice. Well,
and it's interesting because they think their, source of the whole issue is contraception. It's always what it comes back to for them. And I was thinking about this earlier, Father Tim. I'd love your take on this. By the way, for those who are just joining us, that's Father Tim Grumbach. I am Timmery, and we are here on Trending. It's great to be with you. The perspective that I was thinking about earlier this week is we live in a time where people are saying we have less and less in common than ever before. And I was thinking about, well, what do we have in common? If people aren't necessarily identifying with some sort of religious Christian worldview, there's this turning away from the Bible for some people. Well, what do we have in common? Well, a lot of people aren't having children anymore. So in many ways, the common denominator is sex. And so for them, well, the answer to everything is do whatever you want sexually. There should be no judgment sexually because that's the only thing we have in common.
Yeah, and it's an identifying factor for a lot of people now, is that it's become less an expression of the love that identifies us and the participation in God's creative act, and more so about my identity is based on my attractions and my sexual expression, rather than the expression be something of our identity. And we're just getting lost in the midst of a sexual culture that is unable to really understand its own identity.
One part that was really interesting, Father Tim, from the interview that Ann Winter did about her character who had the abortion in 13 Reasons Why, again, not recommending the show in any way whatsoever, just talking about her interviews, but during one of her interviews with Entertainment Weekly, she ends up talking about how she was getting into the zone for acting out that abortion part of her character. And she talked about the, quote, vacuum noise and how every time it really got her into the character. And she talked about how raw that noise was. It sounds to me like that noise had an impact. Just that noise of a vacuum, the type of abortion sound, really woke her up in a sense to, wow, this is actually real. Just unfortunately, she's falling on the side of being pro-abortion rather than that convicting her heart some.
Yeah, I was finding it so hard to understand that she could go into that experience and begin to say, wow, this is so real, but then still come out saying, oh, but this is so important that we be able to do this. And not to equate it exactly, but it's almost like going into a war zone and hearing the gunfire, hearing the cannons going off, hearing the cries of dying men, and saying, wow, this is so real. We need to keep doing this. This is important. And it's just really hard for me to understand how she could have had that experience, but still come out. It's almost the complete opposite of anybody who was acting on the set of Unplanned.
Right, and, exactly.
They get the reality of it and they say, oh no, this is awful.
Yeah, and people who were pro-life before have become so ardently pro-life after acting in and watching that movie Unplanned from the same type of experience of the abortion procedure. Here's what stood out to me. I think part of the reason why Ann Winter kind of mentioned how raw and in character the vacuum sound of the abortion was for her, because she's so desensitized. I wonder, what else do you see that is so raw, so intense, so hard that it has gotten you to the point where you are so desensitized that a vacuum noise of ending a human being's life, even if acting, isn't somehow disturbing you?
Yeah. And what a strange risk the show makers have taken in portraying an actual abortion scene, apparently.
Right.
That it could so go the other way of people watching this saying, I can't believe the raw and the power of that sound and how awful that is. But they've taken this risk in order to promote it and show. But it's an interesting turn of emotion for this young woman is that she says that she learned how not to judge her friends because of going through this experience of acting through this experience of an abortion in a TV show. And that's a great thing. That's something that everybody on every side needs to learn, is the difference between judging the person and judging the act. And what is evil? Is it the person or is it the act? And we as Catholics very much say it's the act that's evil. And so our sorrow is for those people who have been drawn into it, who are supporting it and encouraging it and promoting it, and that the people themselves are not evil, but they've been drawn into something that is so evil. So what a strange turn of emotion for her, that it taught her how to not judge those who are experiencing it, but she didn't learn how to judge the act properly.
It is so true. And I think that many would be surprised, kind of bringing this back to the crisis pregnancy center situation, many would be surprised that those counselors have so little judgment for that woman, which is hard, I think, at times, because sometimes you see the nitty gritty of what's going on, but in reality, it's the act that they fight against, and it's that woman that they fight for. Right. And that is the incredible testimony of the crisis pregnancy centers. And for anyone who's not more familiar with the work they do, I encourage you, get in contact with your local crisis pregnancy center. See how you might be able to help get literature to local high schools or wherever it might be, so that more women know of these resources. That's Father Tim Grumbach here with us on Trending. We will be back in just a bit. We'll be talking about things such as the major pro-life case, one of the biggest court cases in the pro-life movement we've seen in a while. That is against David Daleiden here in the state of California, with Planned Parenthood, STEM Express, and some of the other organizations that had been procuring fetal tissue illegally. That's taking the aborted baby parts and selling them for research.
Timmerie will be right back. Send her a tweet at Timmerie. That's TIMMERIE. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, where morality and culture meet, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics.
A little later, we'll be talking about a biopsy that confirms, an autopsy.
We wish it had merely been a biopsy. Yeah.
Yes, unfortunately. An autopsy that actually confirmed that a woman was killed by abortion. We'll get into the nitty gritty of it. And for those who don't know, you'll understand a little bit more about the statistics surrounding deaths as a result of abortion because of this autopsy. So we'll come in on that in just a bit. We'll also be talking about the censorship of pro-life content and who the fact checkers are. But related to all of this, we were talking about crisis pregnancy centers earlier. It's interesting, Father Tim, you pointed out the Knights of Columbus are actually under a lot of heat right now for their pro-life work, which includes their awesome work with crisis pregnancy centers. Yeah,
my experience with the Knights is, going back years and years, is, their great love for the mission of the crisis pregnancy centers. I remember being out in Lancaster for about a year doing some internship while I was in the seminary. And we had a very strong Knights of Columbus organization, and they were doing everything they could to support the center that was out there in the Antelope Valley, buying machines that can help with ultrasounds, and just doing everything that they can support, fundraisers and luncheons and dinners. And that may be one of the reasons that they're very much coming under fire by those in politics. And especially politicians who are members of the Knights of the Columbus are being scrutinized in almost ridiculous ways for those of us who understand the mission of the Knights.
And I saw there's a recent article in a mainstream news area really criticizing the Knights in the way, because for those who don't know, Knights not only are involved in great charitable work, but they also have insurance policies, life insurance policies. Right. And so there was brought into question through some article the way those insurance policies are functioning. From what I've seen yet, there's nothing of concern in what's happening. But I think that, like you said, the reason they're coming under fire is because they are pro-life, which, with that in mind, by the way, that's Father Tim Grumbach. I want your thoughts on this, Father Tim. Recently, Lila Rose of Live Action, many of you know her and her work and the various videos that she releases online. She had a video that came out really talking about how there's no medical reason that a woman should need an abortion. In fact, she's done a number of interviews and speeches on this, and all of a sudden Facebook has been removing her videos or censoring her content, really censoring it, letting her know that all the videos will be, not receiving so much traction distribution or distribution because they've been fact checked. And here's the kicker, Father Tim, the fact checkers.
Who are they?
They are two abortionists.
Oh, you don't say.
And where have we gotten to that all of a sudden Facebook is saying, oh, we'll have abortionists fact check your videos, when in reality we have over 1,000 medical professionals signing from all over the world. In fact, we have gynecologists, all sorts of medical professionals saying that there's no medical necessity for an abortion to save a woman's life.
And these couple of abortion doctors who came out against Lila Rose, one, they are going to be profiting from abortion, so no surprise there that they're promoting this. But also they make this elementary misunderstanding against the pro-life movement and the understanding that there is no medical necessity for an abortion to save a mother's life. What they misunderstand is, one, the very elementary in the catechism, the law of double effect, and understanding that, yes, there are medical procedures that can be done to protect a mother's life that will, as a double and unintended effect, take the life of the child. But this is not an intended and direct abortion. And so they're misunderstanding that that's still a possibility within Catholic ethics and morality, and saying that, Lila Rose doesn't know what she's talking about. Oh gosh, if anyone knows what they're talking about, it would be her.
I do a lot of pro-life apologetics trainings with young people, and just this past summer there was we were doing a mock debate. Half the kids in the room were pro-abortion, half were pro-life, and they just do, you guys, you would be just amazed by the level of depth and real compassion in the arguments that not only they're creating on the pro-life side, but they're responding to on the pro-abortion side. And one of the kids pretending to be pro-abortion said, well, my wife is pregnant and she's going to die if she doesn't have this abortion. If she has this baby, she's going to die. And it was interesting because all the kids went silent, dead silent. They didn't know what to say. They knew it was wrong, but they had so much compassion for the woman in this mock situation. Here's the reality. Father Tim just really pointed out that the church is talking about the law of double effect. So if a woman is pregnant and she needs a treatment because she has cancer, she can go through that treatment for cancer. Now that might really pose extreme risks to that baby, but that doesn't mean she has to forego the treatment. She could choose to. That would be very heroic, and she would be filled with graces to do so.
And we have a number of saints in the Catholic Church who are known for making that very heroic act.
Many. One of most recently, Saint Gianna of Mola. It's really incredible to see, but here's the reality. Whether it's an earlier pregnancy or a later point in the pregnancy, you can do a preterm delivery. Now that child might not be a viability, therefore the child may not be able to live outside of the womb, but that is not a direct killing of the baby.
Right. And to clarify a little bit more on the law of double effect and how it applies to a case where a mother's life may be in danger during pregnancy, but not because of the pregnancy. One of the actually recent cases that this really came to a head was actually in Phoenix. You might remember it was about 8 or 9 years ago. There was an abortion performed in a Catholic hospital. And Bishop Olmsted, who we've talked about his writings and his teachings here on Trending before, threatened to or decided to take away the Catholic identity of that hospital because a direct abortion was committed to save this mother's life. And it's easy from the outside of the church to judge the church on that, to judge the bishop on that, and say they're so behind the times. They don't care about the woman. They don't care about the mother's life. But what had been decided was to perform this abortion to save the life of a mother who, I believe she was having some serious blood pressure issues, and her heart was not going to be able to survive.
It's usually called preeclampsia.
That very well may be what it was. And instead of treating the illness, they performed an abortion. And the bishop said, that's an abortion, and this is a Catholic hospital. It will no longer be a Catholic hospital, and that decision was made. So it really raised the question of what is the law of double effect? How does it come into play here? And to define that, looking at the Catechism, number 2263, and that's actually in the section of "Thou shalt not kill" when looking at the Ten Commandments, and it refers to an act of self-defense against an aggressor may have a double effect. One is the preservation of one's own life, and the other is the killing of the aggressor. Now, the analogy, we have to be very careful because a child in the womb is not an unjust aggressor,
right?
But that it still refers to it in the context of self-defense, that one self-preservation, that one action is intended, but the other is not. The preservation of life is intended, the taking the life of the other is not. And so that can be applied to the situation of saving a mother's life. For example, if if a child begins to develop outside of the uterus, this is something that will, the child will not survive, and very likely the mother will not as well. And so what is intended is not the direct killing of this child, but the resolution of the what's not right, of what's not developing correctly.
And this is a perfect example, because in the case of, let's give two examples, whether it's, I'm thinking of hypermesis now, preeclampsia, where a woman is going to have seizure risk, she's going to have high blood pressure. This is, if caught early, they would actually do, in many cases, an early delivery, or they might do an emergency C-section. There are another number of things that would be done. In fact, one of my closest friends ended up having preeclampsia. They didn't catch it ahead of time. She was going into labor, and she very, very, very likely could have died while giving birth. It was a very, very difficult situation, incredibly pro-life family. And this is where, again, if caught, which it should be caught because it's being monitored, we're able to see, okay, well, an early delivery or various treatment can be given. But an early delivery is the answer. It's not an abortion. And an early delivery, unfortunately, if that child cannot survive outside of the womb, that was never the intent. As soon as that child is delivered via C-section, whatever it might be, the doctors are fighting for both the mother and the child to the best of their ability. And that's where we have this, was saying, love them both.
And right, and the Latin for primum non nocere, first do no harm, is this is a regular rule of the doctor's life, and unfortunately, it is not the case for abortion doctors. Is first do no harm. So I'm curious, that debate that was happening with those young people, was there a resolution?
In allowing the conversation to continue to move forward, we didn't interrupt the debate, but helping them to see that actually there's never a medical necessity for an abortion. Right. They see that now, and they see that even, there's a reason why all the OBGYNs, gynecologists do not perform abortions. I think it's well over 80%, I think closer to 90 that don't perform abortions, because it's not basic life-saving medical health care for women.
Right. And that Dublin statement from the 1,000 plus physicians and doctors who said that there's no medical necessity for an abortion to save a mother's life. And so it would be really important, in a debate like that, to be able to ask the right questions about what is the medical procedure in order to protect the mother's life. Doing one's best to protect the child's life as well, knowing that may be an unintended consequence as well.
Yeah, and we need to spread the word. I think this is where you come in, because we need you to help people understand this argument. There's a difference between direct killing and early delivery. Yeah. Early delivery does not intend the killing of the child, nor does, say, a treatment intend the killing of a child. And so we need to really, through word of mouth, have these conversations, because these conversations are being censored online. And although I don't like the online censorship, what I do like is that it forces us to remember that we need to get uncomfortable and not hide behind a computer or a cell phone screen.
And that the intention of an act is so important too, as well, to be able to explain, Catholic morality, natural law, being able to understand that what the pro-abortion movement does not have the language for, is that we understand the sources of morality come from the object of an act, its intention, and also the circumstances. Is that it's not as black and white as we would like for it to be, but it's the intention of an act, our intended goal, the primary end by which we're performing an act, does have an effect on our culpability and the morality of the act.
Coming up, we'll actually be talking about a case where an autopsy has revealed that abortion was the cause of the woman's death. And in fact, it gets into this whole health risk of whether or not someone should have been delivering a baby to begin with.
You can listen to more of Trending via the podcast on iTunes or the iHeartRadio app, where you can share your favorite episodes. You're listening to Trending with Timmery.
Hey there, I wanted to share this story with you. It's really important. It has to do with a woman who died after giving birth, after receiving an abortion. Sorry, my words are a little off today. This woman, who's a mother of a 4-year-old, just earlier this year, at the beginning of the summer, went in to have an abortion in Cleveland. Now, this abortion clinic actually has over 24 recorded emergencies within the clinic. Now, those are just recorded emergencies because, as we know, especially if you listen to the testimony of many of the people who worked in the abortion industry, they really try to cover up medical emergencies that take place. In fact, this clinic's been known for telling people to walk outside of the abortion clinic and then call 911 because they didn't want to document emergency or any major health problem in their facility. So here's the story. This young woman in Cleveland went in to have the abortion. She had the abortion, was left to go home. It was an outpatient procedure. She's someone who, in performing the autopsy, they found never should have had the abortion, yet alone an outpatient abortion. She was actually at very high risk. In fact, she had 2 babies. She had one baby that was a regular in utero pregnancy, but the other baby the twin had developed in the fallopian tube. Father Tim Grumbach is here with me. I'd love your perspective on this. So what happened is it seems like at some point the fallopian tube, likely from the pressure of the abortion and the suction, was caused to burst, and the woman died as a result of bleeding that entered into the abdominal area from the abortion.
And this is something that any clinic should have been able to notice before performing any kind of procedure, which, it creates a very dark irony that they would look at crisis pregnancy centers and call them fake abortion clinics when we have these so-called clinics who can't even note something as basic and as dangerous as this before they perform a procedure. And to be known as a clinic, we can use the scare quotes if we'd like, that has these medical emergencies rather consistently. And so it does create a very dark irony that, we don't want to laugh at, but we have to point out.
Well, and it's frustrating, Father Tim, because not only did she have a tubal pregnancy that was undiagnosed, obviously, but also she had a heart condition that would have put her at very high risk to have an abortion. And so this is absolutely unacceptable medical care. It gives no cause for concern for patients. And the fact that this woman was doing so poorly immediately after the abortion facility makes me question if they ever even should have released her from that clinic.
Yeah, it's incredible to look at the stats. It says that her heart probably weighed about twice as much as the average adult heart. And just looking at that and saying, how could they not be aware of the dangers that they were entering into first? I don't want to go into a doctor's office, a hospital that can't even notice something like that before performing a procedure that would, put one's heart under such great distress, and then to miss something as obvious as they did.
Looking at this, I just want to shout out to everyone who's in the Cleveland area. There's a call to action for all of you. In fact, on September 17th, there's going to be a press conference in front of this abortion clinic because they have harmed enough women. And so I really want to call all of you who are in or near the Cleveland area there in Ohio, please come out and support this press conference. Stand up and honor this woman who died while others are not having respect for her life as seen through the poor medical care that she received. Coming up, we're going to be talking about Elon Musk here. Father Tim Grumbach is in studio. You're listening to Trending. So Elon Musk had some words of wisdom this summer. In fact, he referred to this decline in the population. I don't know if you know, but here in the United States, we're at a replacement level of about 1.7. Basic replacement level is 2.1. And Elon Musk has acknowledged that one of the biggest problems facing the world is this population collapse.
Yeah, and we've got this pseudoscience of overpopulation and the population explosion, that there will not be enough resources, not enough land, and everything like that. And this is something that's been going on since the 60s or the 70s, with really a pseudoscience that's been disproved over and over again, as far as the population growing throughout the world and the world becoming sustainable, the population becoming unsustainable. So it's interesting to hear a voice as prominent as Elon Musk's now saying what the opposite of this pseudoscience that has become rather popular, even within the political sphere, of talking about how are we going to handle overpopulation, and the solution almost always being, contraception and abortion, rather than distribution of resources and how about virtue? Trying that out.
I look at this, and Elon Musk, I really want to say thank you, because he's going to really be pulling, I think, more attention to this issue. I mean, even the royal family out there in England can't even acknowledge this. You have Meghan Markle and Prince Harry talking about how they're only going to have, at most, I think they said 2 children. They vowed to only have 2. Good grief. Do you not recognize? And Elon Musk himself said it. It's very out of date if you still think there's a population problem. And demographers have been warning us for years. Father Tim, there is a population issue. We're overpopulated with older people. Does that mean we kill them? No, that means part of the problem is that we don't have enough young people because they aren't being born to care for the elderly.
Yeah, well, that's a whole nother conversation to have. We can look at Belgium and the Netherlands and Luxembourg and just that whole section of Europe right there. Well, we can talk about that later. But what this calls to mind for me, every time the idea of a population collapse or a population explosion comes up, I think of this ridiculous movie that came out, I don't know, 10 or 20 years ago called Idiocracy.
Okay, I keep being told about this movie.
Yeah.
I still haven't seen it yet.
Yeah. The general idea is that this guy who's not too bright, he's a part of the army. There are very smart people in the army. All my siblings very smart. But this guy is he's kind of run out of options, and so he agrees to let himself be cryogenically frozen. And at some point, they forget about him in the project. And then I think there's some great world-ending thing that happens, and he's forgotten, and he wakes up, how many ever hundreds of years later, and it turns out he's the smartest man alive. And this is because all of the smart and successful people stopped having children. Mm. They either waited too late or they didn't have time for children. Does this sound familiar at all?
Right.
And the only people who were having children were pardon this, but the rednecks and the idiots. And so the world became dumber as the idiots had more children. But it's not happening that way right now. We can look at some traditional Catholic circles and see these large families are coming back into the front and filling our churches, and maybe that's the population explosion that we need is these good faithful Catholic families doing their best, not perfectly, but doing their best to be faithful to the teachings of the church and to welcome life. We as a church, if we stay faithful to the teachings of Humanae Vitae and everything that has come out since then from the church and
before that,
Casta Canubi and all these tremendous teachings on the gift of human fertility and the gift of sharing in God's creative act. With that kind of fidelity, the church is going to come back to life.
There's a reason that studies are showing that the happiest women out there are women who come from religious homes who are having children. There's a reason that we are seeing that as female happiness declines, people who choose to follow the path of sacrificial love in having a family are happier. And I think this is a reminder of hope for us that although we may see the population on the decline, that we as Catholics, of people of faith, are called to continue to follow the first and most basic commandment to be fruitful and multiply. And with that, the church dives into how you have a responsibility for the formation of that human being.
Yeah, and just statistically looking at what has happened in China, for example, with their former one-child policy. What do they have? It's a two-child policy now?
It's technically a two-child policy, but you still have to get permission.
Yeah, but statistically, consider that. What is it? It's been about 400 million children who've not been born because of that.
Right.
Consider that. 400 million souls that could have been contributing to this world, contributing to a better world, creating means of distributing resources, and instead they use this consequentialist idea of if we are without these children, we will be able to better control our population. We'll be able to better control, completely misunderstanding God's command to us to be fruitful and multiply, and the traditional understanding of having these large families who can take care of one another. Instead, what we're turning into is an idiocracy of sorts, where the people who are considered wise and successful by this world are fading away because they're not having children, so they don't have these large families around them to take care of them as they grow older. And then we turn into something like Belgium or the Netherlands, where the elderly can be euthanized at very tremendously vulnerable points of illness, even if it's merely but mental illness, not necessarily a physical illness that is terminal, but a mental illness can be a reason. And so it's all about this culture of death kind of winding itself together, weaving itself together with this denial of God's command towards fruitfulness.
And if you're listening, I have a challenge for you. As we're talking about this, how can you help be the answer? My question for you is, what is getting in the way of you having a family? What's getting in the way? I hear these excuses, especially, I get it. I live in Southern California. It's expensive. And I hear people all the time say, I cannot afford to have another child. It is not possible. What do you need to do? What changes do you need to make? What maybe simplicity of life do you need to adopt? Because we live in a world of consumerism. And I remember having a guest on a couple of months ago, and she talked about, the sacrifices that were made to live on a single income. And she talked about her mother, how they lived on a single income. Her mother had one beautiful dress, and that was it. It's what she wore on Sundays. It's what she wore to nice events. That was one of the sacrifices that their family had made in order to make sure that her mother growing up was present.
Yeah, what a beautiful gift of sacrifice that she received then, to be able to see that and to share that with her own family. And we live in Southern California. It gets a little bit expensive. And
Right.
So, sacrifices must be made. And when we come to the point of sacrifice, there may still be further sacrifices where mothers do need to work, but we do need to do our best to make sure that the mother can be there for her children. Yeah, there's a lot to be said and argued about for that. But, understanding our circumstances and responsibility, right.
Yeah, I think responsibility is so key. There's such a debate over working versus stay-at-home moms and single or dual income. At the end of the day, it comes to the level of responsibility for your family. And we are so distracted from being present to one another. And we need to stop allowing the children to be the ones who've hurt because of it. We'll be right back. We're going to come up talking about some of the current presidential candidates to take on pro-life policy, along with the trial of David Daleiden.
Timmerie will be right back. Send her a tweet at Timmerie. That's TIMMERIE. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, where morality and culture meet, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics.
That's Father Tim Grumbach. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. We've had some weigh-in on pro-life policy that I briefly want to touch on. Bernie Sanders, one of the current candidates for the presidency, has really been talking about how we need to kind of allow for things such as Mexico City policy for, foreign funding over abortion. And it's so disturbing because really it goes back to this really out-of-date mentality, which was never correct to begin with, that we need to control the population.
Yeah, we need to control the population of the world, because if it explodes, we'll have no resources, or we will destroy the earth, as if there's a true care for the earth and not just for the resources that the earth has for us. I've always wondered about that, this true care for the world and our worry about destroying it. I think it's more so a fear that we won't have what we need to survive, rather than an actual genuine care for creation. But with that said, the reason that Bernie Sanders puts forward for the need for contraception, funding contraception and abortion as a part of our foreign aid to other nations, is to help control overpopulation. This was part of these debates about the climate,
climate change.
Yes, and that the question what came up with so many of these Democratic possible nominees for the presidency is, what will you do about overpopulation? And almost the first thing that Sanders goes towards is, appealing the Mexico City policy and promoting foreign aid in the form of, funding abortion and contraception.
I'm getting so mad here just as you're talking, because the question to begin with, if you're not listening, please go back and listen, is stupid. The question is stupid. Why are we talking about overpopulation? You have Italy and Hungary giving incentives to their people to have children. All of Europe is below replacement level by a lot, and so is the United States. And we could talk and go on and on about this. China is facing a crisis. By next year, they're going to have over 30 million unmarriable men because there are no spouses. They are literally importing. Mail order brides are no joke in China. They're importing women into their country so these men can marry. And just think about the level of sexual exploitation, manipulation, and abuse those women are going through. Are you kidding me? Overpopulation is not a problem.
Right. And that their solution is to especially look at poorer countries to prevent their overpopulation.
I'm feeling triggered, Father.
Yeah, I don't know for sure what the intention of their heart is when they bring that up, but what it sounds like is, let's make sure those poorer countries stop producing poor children and poor people.
And that is eugenics. I think a movie came out, just a year or so ago, one of the, was it Civil War? Which one of the Marvel movies was it, with all the Avengers?
Right.
Years ago?
Well, you had Civil War, you have Infinity War, you have Endgame.
Okay, it was Infinity War, right? And ultimately, the bad guy was the one who was implementing eugenics. Now, his eugenics might have seemed a little less bad because essentially just half of the randomized population disappears. Well, here it's even worse. It's intentional killing.
Right, yeah. Thanos' intention in the Marvel Cinematic Universe was to destroy half of the population of the universe in order to make sure that everyone had enough resources, because of overpopulation. So I don't know if this great big Hollywood production realized what they were doing, talking about the solution to overpopulation is killing half the population. They realized exactly what it was that they were saying, that they were pretty much putting the words of the pro-abortion cult into the language, into the words of Thanos, a name which is very similar to the Greek word for death, Thanatos, and that the bad guy is the one who desires a solution to population explosion. And by doing so, he was just going to snap his fingers and make all of half of the population of the universe go away. And the question always came up: well, why don't you just snap your fingers and make like twice as many resources? But that is not the way that death thinks.
Hey, that's what's sad in the culture right now. That's Father Tim Grumbach. You are listening to Trending with Timmery. Right now, we are in the middle of the preliminary hearings for the probably biggest pro-life case you will hear for some time. That is with David Daleiden, Planned Parenthood, STEM Express, and other fetal tissue procurement groups and those who are involved. You may remember back in 2015, David Daleiden came out with a series of videos exposing Planned Parenthood, the Abortion Federation of America, and multiple organizations for their illegal profiting of aborted baby parts, also for the illegal manipulation of the abortion procedures. So in fact, they were delivering babies born alive, changing the abortion procedures to be illegal procedures like partial birth abortion. This has been absolutely atrocious. It's merited a congressional investigation that occurred, which they were then recommended for prosecution. I mean, we could go on and on. And now here, David Daleiden and his team are facing over 15 counts of felony and up to 10 years in prison.
Yeah, it's really hard to believe. Well, I guess it's not so hard to believe anymore. It's almost not even surprising anymore to see someone who is unveiling the horrors of the abortion industry is attacked in such a political and judicial way and has this many counts brought against him for revealing just really the horror of it all.
It's interesting, if you're looking at any of the preliminary hearings, one thing that's interesting, not only is Facebook been blocking Live Action Live LaRose, but Twitter has been blocking David Daleiden from his live tweets. And I think part of the reason not only is because they're taking a pro-abortion stance through Twitter, but also because the content is so horrifically blunt and revealing in and of itself. And it's interesting because the pro-abortion groups are putting up witnesses that they think are just going to do an incredible job lying. They get up there, they start lying, and David Daleiden slides up another video, he and his attorneys, and it directly contradicts all of these statements that these pro-abortion witnesses and abortions are making on the stand.
Yeah, we've been promised that this was going to happen, right?
Right.
Nothing is in the dark that won't be brought to light. And I think that the more and more that we see of the horrors of the abortion industry, the more we realize how ridiculous their defense of it will seem. I've always been convinced that when Satan begins to bring his darkness out more and more, it becomes more and more violent, but it will attack itself. And we'll be able to look at it and say, this is ridiculous. This is a very poorly put together attack compared to the defense and the protection that God has in store for his holy ones. That what we're seeing here is the darkness coming to light, and it may take some time, but I think we will eventually be able to look back at this almost the way that we look back at slavery here in the United States, and to say that we're still, yes, there are still repercussions from it, and in certain parts of the country, but that we can look back on and say, we defended this as a nation. There were parts of our nation who defended this, and that seems ridiculous to us now. But my hope is that we'll be able to have the patience, and those who support abortion now will one day be able to look back at this and receive with humility this darkness being brought into light, and receive a conversion of heart and be able to say, what a terrible ridiculousness. This is almost cosmically humorous what the darkness is trying to do in the light.
And I think a lot of people are being called to make great sacrifices to stand up for truth right now. I think of people living modern day saints like St. John Paul the Great, who lived under communist Russia, who lived underneath the communism of China, who lived underneath, the suppression of what took place during World War II in Nazi Germany. I look at people who lived in Lithuania, who lived under communism and spoke up and rallied and took arms in the streets to prevent just the oppression of the people and the oppression of religious liberty. And we could go on. And I think David Daleiden is one of those people who's willing to make the sacrifice, possibly facing years in prison, but I don't think that he has any fear. He has 15 attorneys. The pro-abortion movement has an army of attorneys, and we're talking numbers of attorneys in the thousands here. And yet truth wins. Even if we're knocked down in this small battle, we've already won the war. And so we need everyone to lean in, to pray. And in fact, I've posted links online where you can donate to his trial currently taking place. In fact, the main trial begins October 1st or 2nd-ish, I believe.
Yeah, and I'll bring up another name of a soul that spoke out so powerfully and sacrificed everything for the sake of that, Saint Mother Teresa.
Yes.
This is a woman that nobody, some tried. Was it Christopher Hitchens, maybe one of the new atheists who tried to speak against her? But aside from that delusion, there's nobody who could say she didn't love the people who were in front of her. She didn't love men. She didn't love women. She didn't love children. Nobody could say that. Yet she could get up in front of, who was it, the UN, yes, and say that abortion is a war of mothers against their children. Abortion creates violence between mothers and their children. And so this is a woman who knew the darkest part of humanity and would be able to, point that out to the light and say, hey, look what this is doing to our souls, to the nations that consider themselves prosperous are actually, in great spiritual poverty because of what we are allowing our, mothers to do to their children, and fathers who do not stand up to protect their children as well. And so we're seeing that, we don't want to compare anyone to Saint Mother Teresa, Saint John Paul II right now. They are, anybody fighting against this, you are living out your own sainthood in your defense of life and the sanctity of life. But take their example and see that they sacrificed everything in order to be able to say what they say and live the way that they lived.
When I was growing up, my mom had corresponded with Saint Mother Teresa in a series of letters.
Oh, wow.
Part of it was in recognition of the pro-life work she was doing in opening up the maternity home. And one of the things that Mother Teresa really emphasized was essentially the spiritual poverty that we live in. And many people talk today about how we're being called to a white martyrdom. You may not have your head chopped off the way we are seeing it happen in the Middle East, but you very well may be called to lay everything down in a white martyrdom. And that's going to require of you to give up a lot of the worldly goods that we are so disorderly attached to. Start it now or you will not be prepared.
This has been Trending with Timmerie. To book her to speak or learn more about her guests, visit radiotrending.com. That's radiotrending.com. You can listen to more of Trending via the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or the iHeartRadio app, where you can share your favorite episodes.